Welcome to the British Academy. It's a great pleasure to see you all here. And I think today, in one of our global outreach programs, we are delighted to have with us Sada Mire, one of the great new, younger archaeologists from Somalia. And if you saw that opening set of clips, I think we've got an event today that covers pretty well all of those taglines. It's something about understanding culture, it's about shaping policy, it's about understanding the past, it's about understanding the world through both cultural heritage in terms of tangible and in terms of intangible items. And so I'd like to start by welcoming Sada and ask her to speak for 5 minutes or so. Then I'll be asking her some questions about her work. And then after about 40 minutes of our general discussion, we'll be opening it to you for some questions. And if you type in your questions into the chat, we'll be able to answer them, we hope. So, Sada, welcome. Welcome back to the British Academy. It's a great pleasure to have you here and a great honor for us. And I'd like to ask you, first of all, to say just a few words about your work, and then we'll get into some decent discussion.
Thank you very much, Professor Simon Goldhill, and thank you everyone for joining us. I'm very honoured to be giving this British Academy lecture. So the topic I'm talking on today, cultural understanding and peace, is something that has emerged from my work recently. Archaeology, though, has in the past century often been used to rather divide rather than unite people. And we have seen this in conflicts around the world. I remember when I first started off as a student in archaeology in Lund University in 2002, there was this news of riots in India, of the destruction of the Ayodhya Mosque. This is a mosque in Ayodhya which was 500 years old, and it just opened my mind to the fact that archaeology can become a battlefield and lead to bloodshed in the current world, and in fact how the past is actually very much present, and that archaeology is very much part of the social life, whatever, in every sense of the word. And also of course, India is not the only place where you can find this dualism, and whether it's nationalistic, ethno-nationalism or religious nationalism. We have seen it also recently in Europe, in the Balkans, for example, where we had wars and Christians and Muslims who fought against each other, but also destroyed a lot of heritage there, both Muslim and Christian. But the interesting sort of thing is that in the context of, this is very much a global problem. And even in my part of the world, in the Horn of Africa, as an archaeologist exploring the region, I could see these dualistic perspectives on heritage, and how heritage actually on archaeology can become a source of division rather than unification. But in being also this context of Africa, we also have the, if you like, on top of that, the colonial narrative of Africa, and whether Africa had history, civilizations, or achievements and technology. So my work in rewriting African history has been about, firstly, obviously exploring and doing surveys and shedding light on the history of Africa, but at the same time also finding the meaning and use of the archaeological work for the present societies. And working in such a divided and recently volatile region as the Horn of Africa, archaeology is not a privilege. Archaeology is something that is very much alive in the sense of people's identity, and is very much a debated topic. And for me to understand further this relationship with how we then can use cultural understanding to develop a connection and link with not only the different peoples who live in the region and go beyond the national dominant narratives, whether that is based on ethnicity or religion, but also explore the commonalities of these peoples across the Horn of Africa has been a significant part of my recent work. And this has led to my recent book, Divine Fertility, which is exploring those ideas around fertility. And in fact, I have now realized after 10 odd years of researching that peace itself is prerequisite to, it's a condition for getting fertility. So a harmonious society is in the local philosophy is seen as a society worthy of fertility. So humans who can resolve their problems, who can live in a harmonious way, and this is very much part of how people lived in this region for many centuries. Now we see wars in the past 60 years, but also we have to ask, for at least 300 years before that, we had no major conflicts. So what glued these people together beyond the politics and the economical situation? And that seems to be culture very much. I'll end it there, and we can move on to questions.
Thanks very much, Sada. My first question to you is about the concept of heritage that you use. The very notion of heritage is a 19th century idea. It's an imperial invention, very much connected to the British Empire in some ways, although also France and Germany. And you've argued for cultural heritage not just as important, but almost as a human right, a transcultural, transnational benefit. So my question to you is, can we reconcile the politics involved with the notion of heritage with a changing cultural world? Isn't heritage sometimes a way of holding society still when society wants to move? Isn't it looking to the past in a way that tries to fix things when society is changing? Ruskin said, buildings are like human beings. They have a natural lifespan. Let them fall down. If they fall down, they fall down. We'll move on. We'll build other buildings. So how do you think your plea for cultural heritage is a rhetorical gesture, or are you really committed to it as a way, we have to hold this thing in place?
Well, this is interesting because actually my approach, me saying that cultural heritage is a basic human right, comes from multiple perspectives. One is the fact that we are thinking beings. So we don't only need food and shelter to survive. And I know this firsthand as a refugee surviving as in fact, IDP, before we even could become a refugee, when we were wandering around fleeing war. And I realized actually the things that my family or my society taught me about my culture, all the summers I'd spent putting together a hut and spending time with my grandmother in the countryside, which I thought was an awful way to spend your summer, turned out to be quite useful in a situation where you've had to leave your home, and all you have to resort to is, in fact, what you know about your culture, what you can produce from scratch. And it brought me directly to the notion of what I call the knowledge-centered approach, which is of the nomadic perspective. Knowledge is transferred through practice and through oral transmission. And in seeing that, actually, becoming part of that in a very living way, having been a city dweller up to that point, and then benefiting from this latent, if you like, cultural knowledge, it just made me see that, in fact, we survived a war thanks to our cultural heritage. And you can look at places like Somaliland, which has used cultural cultural resources and conflict resolution methods to build peace and nascent democracy. And all of this has shown me, and also looking at, the way the perspectives that we have as a society, in Somali society, our traditional law here, it's a lot about preserving values and gluing people together. So for me, that was the inspiration behind this way of viewing heritage. At the same time, yes, I think societies are evolving all the time. So in fact, by having this perspective, the knowledge-centered approach, the definition is basically we preserve knowledge, not objects and monuments. And with that goes, in fact, the whole set of intangible manner of preserving heritage, not necessarily static buildings and saying, yes, we want this to stand, that building to stay there forever, but in fact thinking, what does it mean to us today, and does it serve a purpose? I don't think we want to preserve every potsherd, and also societies are very dynamic, and from the Horn of Africa, you will find somebody who's nomadic, but who also owns a smartphone, and they are not less traditional or less modern, or more modern for having that. So it's a way of seeing that, in fact, it's a certain multi-temporality that's constantly moving us, and we are selecting constantly and taking certain things with us and leaving certain things behind.
That's very interesting. Now, I suppose the two most important big social changes that have taken place in my lifetime in my Western community would be the rise of feminism and the rise of gay rights. And I wish I could say the same is true of racism, but it's not. And I suppose what I would say is that what my parents knew, my grandparents knew in terms of ideas about gender or about sexuality are not things that I want my children to know. Am I destroying a cultural heritage by doing that for you? Do we not see that there's a way forward, a way of benefiting, of society becoming better through social change, which a lot of people would see as a collapse of value? How would you react to that? Because that's obviously an issue that becomes very important as we talk about modernization, which is a horrible word and a very charged word. But if we talked about values and said, do you want to live by the values of your grandparents when it comes to gender?
This is very interesting, because I think it's about how we also view societies inheriting knowledge, inheriting norms, inheriting values. And those things change. And what we are now, what we can today define as past views, were at some point the new views of others in the past. But in terms of passing on new views and not losing, or whether, for example, gay rights or feminism, in fact, if you look at ancient societies, we are very conservative in many ways than what I see in some of the narratives or some of the stories of many civilizations. So we have this concept and belief that we are going forward, but sometimes, in fact, we are going backward and going in cyclical ways. So there was times when women had a stronger positions than they do today in certain societies, and there were much more varied ways of partnerships that were accepted in certain cultures and civilizations. So what we have inherited in the past few centuries may not be what some others in the past before that could have seen as, if you like, an advancement. So we are not aware of the fact that we are actually sometimes the values we have could be much more conservative than the ones that our ancestors had at some point.
Now, what would you say to, at the moment, in terms of the current politics? There's a huge amount of work going into attempts to control what the story of the past is for current political ends. Most academics regard this as disgraceful, passing laws that say you can only talk about my country in a particularly sanctioned way. And if you say something that's out of bounds of this particular history, even if it's true, you'll be prosecuted. How do you deal with that issue, that there are really superpowers in the state or in government that are trying to control that cultural heritage that you're trying to preserve? How does that sort of tension get worked out in your work?
Of course, there's always, the problem with nationalism has always been this element of course, it's a political and economic unit, but culture transcends this, and culture is actually what often motivates human beings. So identity and this directing of what can be told, what can be said, or what can be preserved in terms of heritage is, again, this going back to this kind of lack of freedom that often the criticism against nationalism has been about, this machinery, this mechanical way of the individual, you sign up to more than you wanted to as a citizen, if you like. So, of course, for me, looking at how divided the debate at the moment is, how divided the global situation is, what's happening in the most powerful nations, there are consequences from that rhetoric into that impact heritage and archaeology, that impact teaching of culture, that impact widening perceptions, that maybe perhaps these, if you like, leaders or these powerful groups feel may threaten them, because especially culture is that area which is limitless in its approach, and it transcends ethnic, religious, and national boundaries, and connects people on levels that could mobilize them. So culture is very powerful, and for some threatening.
Well, that leads immediately to the next question. One of the things I've learned from reading your work and listening to you is just how varied the cultural interactions are in the Horn of Africa over a long period, how different groups interact. And I have two questions, really. They're related questions. The first one is, what do you think is at stake in telling a history about these transitional zones of exchange, where you see different communities coming together, exchanging ideas, syncretic ideas, arguing over ideas? And how do we write that history that doesn't just become, as it were, a mess, just doesn't say, look, lots of people got together, it was a mess? And the second question that follows, and you'll see why they're connected, is, I've done quite a lot of work in my time on Jerusalem, and that's a fascinating place where, as in the Horn of Africa, you'll find shrines that were once used by Christians, Muslims, and Jews at the same time, without a problem. But now it's extremely hard for that to happen. And I'm worrying about thinking about what are the forces that make it sometimes impossible to imagine cultural hybridity, and what are the forces that make it so aggressive towards cultural simplicity. So those two questions. So I'm asking you about the history that you want to write. On the one hand, you said you want to write a history of Africa. Well, is it a history of African identity, or is it a history of zones of exchange? And then what are the forces that are dragging you in either direction towards a single idea of identity or multiplicity? And why is it just now that people are getting so upset and demanding a naive, simple form of nationalist identity, or has that always been there and we're just noticing it differently now?
I think it's often about the lack of representation. I think we have to go back to colonial times and colonial narratives, and this idea of how people have lost heritage, but also how they've had to disown rather their own heritage, whether it's through, Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart comes to mind, where he's not only looking at how the ways that his society is changing, and he's writing about this external force that is initiating these fundamental changes, but also looking at how trying to see what his society was like, were there things that needed to be changed. And I think in writing about Africa and in writing very much about post-colonial Africa, we have one element, which is, of course, we have to show what's happened in Africa. We have to show not just the colonial history, but we have to also show, or potential arrested development, but we also have to show what Africa was like before the colonial times. But at the same time, again, we may be going back to what you were saying about what to preserve, but then in terms of looking at things fall apart, what he's looking at this society, and with himself, it needs to also change. There were things that are problematic in the belief systems or the practices. But then you're looking at decolonizing and writing African history on one level from the point of view of responding to colonialism and saying Africa had civilizations, technologies and everything. And on the other hand, you're forced to also have an internal dialogue that things were not always great. There were things that needed changing in societies. I mean, my society, we have FGM, female circumcision. So we have also bad heritage, if you like. And also you have this element of nationalism, which then, whether that is ethnic, religious, or whichever form it takes, guides the researcher up to a degree, and controls what one writes, what one represents as history of a country, and it becomes, in a way, a huge responsibility for the scholarship. For example, for a long time in Ethiopian studies, you've had this focus on state and church, and now recently more and more studies are looking at widening that understanding of Ethiopia. Ethiopia often seen as this Christian country, but in fact, Islam is also a big religion in if you like, in Ethiopia, and there are also traditionalists. So, and then you have next door Somalia, Somaliland, where you have 100% Muslim society. Yet, if you look at the archaeology, of course, before Somalis were Muslims, there were other religions that were available to them that they also adhered to. So, and that, I think, creates an opportunity then to have an internal dialogue within the Horn of Africa to see beyond this kind of dominant or perhaps national history.
That's really interesting. I was involved for a while in a project in Jerusalem, a UNESCO project, about producing multiple narratives for the same site, so that there would be a Jewish, a Christian, and a Muslim story for the same site, which offered not lies, obviously. It didn't do, one was true and one was false. It used similar facts, if not the same facts, but it told the story from a different perspective. And I wondered whether you thought there was a chance in Africa now for multiple perspectives, narratives to be produced that would allow for these different voices to emerge, or whether we're still trying to produce the single story that inevitably oppresses some other stories.
This is really I think the interesting thing about looking at the Horn of Africa again, because I remember first time I visited the site Aksum, which is a World Heritage Site. It's the site of the most ancient Christianity in sub-Saharan Africa, where the king became Christian in the 4th century AD. And this was, before that, a major pre-Christian site. And the day I visited this place for both those reasons, the fact that it had pre-Christian history, but also a center for Christianity in the past, over millennia, was actually a Muslim wedding taking place at this site. And this just showed me, the importance of places to human beings, regardless of religion, because there is this sense of ancestral link. There is this understanding of a place as sacred. And again, this site, Aksum, is also the site of the first hijrah in Islam, when the Prophet sent his own family members who were persecuted in Medina by his own clan, the Quraysh, and sent them to Aksum to be protected by the other monotheist religion. So the earliest Muslims actually lived at least 13 years in Aksum. And so there's a complexity of history at sites in the Horn of Africa, including the site I focused a lot on in my book, Divine Fertility, the site Ober Khadle, which is near Hargeisa, the capital of Somaliland, and where we located also multi-religious heritage. So there is history of places which have made these places important for centuries. And this is why, for example, at Ober Khadle, the Sheikh came to convert the community. He didn't go to somewhere empty. He went to the seat of the previous religion and converted people. And it shows that beyond anything, there are common places that are understood. And I think looking at that, it makes it, for me, interesting to the possibility that, yes, we can write plural history. We can write, because the past is the past. I mean, people are who they are today, and they are confident in their identity. And I hope that they can understand that their ancestors were different to them. And in fact, that may hopefully lead to them accepting their neighbors, because they see that their neighbors are different, and perhaps think that, that is all right, because in fact, there's also complexities in my own past.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Could you say a word too then about the difference between ownership and use, or ownership and knowledge? Because it seems to me that one of the problems with these sites that are used by multiple groups and multiple groups have feelings about, the trouble seems to be when one group says, well, we own this is ours, you can't come in. How does that work with heritage? Because in some senses, one of the difficulties is that heritage often comes with a notion of ownership as well as identity and an inability to share.
Yes, very much so. And often archaeologists end up trying to, having to deal with that, because in India, the example of Ayodhya, you have Hindu nationalists claiming the land on which the 500-year-old mosque stood, claiming that it was actually built on a Babar, the ruler of India at the time, destroyed they claim he destroyed a Hindu temple in order to build the mosque. So now they are destroying this 500-year-old mosque in order to rebuild that temple. So you have this element of ownership. And then the interesting case with the Ayodhya case was that then there were Buddhists who came and said, actually, we were before the Hindus here. So can the archaeologists dig just a little bit deeper? And so where do we end the story? I mean, should we go back to Stone Age? I mean, so it gets ridiculous when you think about ownership. And I think it's so, at least in the sense of trying to justify it through archaeology, especially if you have multiple communities present, as you do with Buddhism, Hindu society and Muslim society at this site at Ayodhya. But also, as you know, in many parts of the world, it's a very common thing. Archaeologically, we see it everywhere. And it's a problem. I mean, it's a problem to how we actually value things. Do we value things because they belong to us, and we can only value them if we own them? And again, it comes to also the issue of transnational companies taking land of indigenous peoples. It comes to the issue of collections, of colonial collections held in museums. Who owns this heritage? Is it the winner, the one who took, the one who was powerful, who had money, who had guns? Or is it the people who know how to use it? And then it comes the point where they say, okay, well, these people actually don't have resources to keep it, or they have died away, the people who these things belong to, as been said in Mesoamerica about the Mixtec heritage or Maya heritage. Yet you actually see that the Maya and the Mixtec still have traditions that can enlighten the archaeologists about the archaeological heritage. So there are descendants, there are people who have rights and who still speak the languages. So it's a complex field. So it's not just from the perspective of writing national heritage or a history book or defining a site's right owner, but it's part of also our whole world system, a system of ownership. And for example, in my country, we never knew the notion of owning land individually. You owned land collectively. And just in the past 30 years, I can see that places that were just common clan land, now individuals are grabbing that land. So yeah, society is changing.
Yeah, which leads to what I think might be my final question. We'll see. I see there are questions already coming in on the chat, and people know that they can enter questions on the chat. And I have a couple of questions finally about technology, really, which I think is a very interesting area. I have two questions. One of them is just a straight archaeological question, which is there's so much work now being done with DNA data that's revolutionizing what we can tell about communities and their interactions, their diets and their travel. Has that changed your view of the Horn of Africa? That's the sort of first question. And the second question is really about your book that's just come out on fertility. This is an area where technology and heritage clash inevitably and very strongly. That is to say, if we were thinking about fertility in terms of maternal mortality, I think you said earlier that getting pregnant is one of the most dangerous things a woman can do. But it's also the case that even if you live in the West, to have, in the most rich society, the most supportive society, without medical intervention, death rate in pregnancy goes up a huge rate. So in a sense, technology is a way of stopping traditional ways of looking after women in pregnancy. So those are two very different questions about technology. One, the technical one about are you using DNA and materials to learn a different history of Africa? And the second is the more difficult and pressing question about how you fit together your interest in fertility with the necessity of reducing maternal mortality through technological intervention.
Thank you. I think the first question of technology in the sense of using DNA. So far, I have not actually used any DNA yet, but I would probably like to do that at some point in the future. The more important thing would be what questions would I be answering, and for who, and what would this information serve? Of course, it's interesting to use DNA and information like that, especially when we are looking at older materials, say the past 10,000 years. For example, we've seen how in the UK the finding of the Cheddar Man revealed that there were people with dark skin and blue eyes inhabiting in Western Europe 8 to 10,000 years ago, which is quite interesting. And about 10% of the population today carry that DNA. So that is quite useful in the divided sense of the world today, where you have the kind of Brexit world to throw that kind of detail into the to the if you like the mess and see what happens. So I like that element of DNA, but also I think it's much more. It can answer a lot of questions, of course, because we can use it for pathology, ancient diseases. We can use it for so many things, but it also could be a political implication of that, especially more recent materials. The other question regarding maternity mortality and my book and research in fertility rituals. Well, my mother was a midwife, one of the first trained midwives, in fact, trained by the British in Somaliland when it was a British protectorate. And my own twin sister, is obstetrics gynecologist. So this issue of women and maternal mortality is very much something that has been part of the education of women in my family. And for me, seeing that part of women's health benefit from technology is really incredibly important. Yes, as I said earlier, that the most dangerous thing Somali women or women in the Horn of Africa can do is to become pregnant, and it can lead to death. But for me, archaeologically and anthropologically and from a historical point of view, it's been very fascinating understanding fertility rituals. And the fertility rituals, often when we hear, we're thinking it's about women, but it's really more about society and its productivity. So we are talking about a system of productivity that is ideologically justified with a system of thought and social relations and social organization. So it's not just about some kind of midwife, remedies or remedies to become fertile as a woman and kind of hidden into this secluded female domain. But yes, that exists, of course. But the wider element and the reason why that still exists, this secluded side of it, of the taboo of infertility and issues like that, is because for centuries, if not millennia, in the Horn of Africa, in my book I argue, we had what I called divine fertility. And this is a fertility that comes through blessings of ancestors. And there are a whole system of rituals that women go through. But also this fertility rituals includes men's rituals. One of them is the ritual hunt. So men go and do hunting. And often we see images like that with Horn of African men carrying a spear and a shield and are looking like the warrior, which is the one of the stereotypes. But anthropologically, if you scratch the surface, if you look deeper into it, it's really about a wider complex symbolism of the idea of ritual efficacy and being successful in hunting, for example. So that is an area which now opens up to be looked at, not only to understand different ethnomedicine, different rituals, landscapes, sacred objects, and rituals that are connected to those objects and materials, but also how this system of rituals was actually a lot about peacemaking and purification. So again, peace is a condition for fertility, and that element is, in fact, what this whole ideology of fertility is built on. It's this: you can get fertility by performing certain rituals, by interacting with each other and nature in a certain way. And you are blessed by your ancestors, and the ancestors are sacred ancestors, and you yourself spring from that generations of, if you like, religious lineage or divine lineage. This is what I call divine kingship in the Horn of Africa, where we are talking about not just getting fertility by prayers, but in fact it's linked to your lineage. And again, we have these myths of origins that connect people to divinity, and they existed in the past and they exist today. And in that system, there's been also the creation of the non-righteous or outcast clans. And we have that also in Somali culture. So we have, for example, the minority clans, the Gaboye, who have been oppressed, who have been marginalized, who have for centuries suffered this stigma. Yet the interesting element is that they have had social roles in the economic, in the productivity, in this organization of fertility, where they have been responsible for making, either being contributing with medicinal knowledge, or they've been the smiths, surgery. They've been the surgeons. So they've had important roles, but at the same time, they've been subordinated through these myths created through this ideology of fertility.
Thank you. Very, very interesting. Well, we've reached the end of a time of which I get to question you, but there are plenty of questions on the chat, and other people can ask too if they haven't asked yet. Shall I read you the first question? Or I'm not quite sure how to do this. The first question is, how do you navigate the division and conflict amongst them between Somali and Somalilanders when pursuing archaeological research, especially because there's a shared ancient history? I suppose that's an inevitable question for you to answer.
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yes, it's on the chat. It's how do you navigate the division and conflict between Somalis and Somalilanders, between the two countries, as it were, when you're pursuing your archaeological research? Because there's a shared ancient history, right? I mean, the division is a recent one. So do you want to answer that, or would you like to skip it?
Sure. No. I mean, I'm happy to take that question because I think it's something. For me, I mean, identity-wise, I was born in what was at the time Hargeisa, Somalia, and I grew up in. I was first year in Baidao, and then I was in Mogadishu 14 years. The first after that first year of my life, then 14 years I was in Mogadishu. So for me, my personal experience is having this very pan-Somali upbringing, and I was raised by a generation who liberated Somali people from colonial systems, whether that is the British or the Italian. So I've had a lot of pride instilled in me in that, if you like, Somali heritage. But at the same time, I work in Somaliland, and Somaliland is separate from Somalia. And so for me, as an archaeologist, the way I navigate is I respect everybody and everybody's choice. And when I talk about Somali heritage, I talk about it in the sense of Somali heritage being in Djibouti, Somali heritage being in Ethiopia, Somali heritage being in Kenya, and Somali in Somaliland and in Somalia.
Thank you. That's very clear. This is a follow-up question, really. UNESCO doesn't recognise Somaliland heritage, and so can you register Somaliland heritage, or do you have to wait until Somaliland is recognised, or do you register with UNESCO under Somalia? Is there a UNESCO process for that?
Well, this is again the issue of the nation state, and UN has, as far as I know, has not recognized Somaliland. But I mean, of course, UNESCO label can always benefit a site up to a degree, but we have also seen UNESCO label, in fact, lead to destruction of sites. And apart from on the positive side, when it could be the fact that it lends a bit more of its value to a site, but I don't think really for Somaliland the most important thing in terms of, I mean, it depends on why we want sites on the UNESCO World Heritage Site. UNESCO World Heritage Site, you can have sites there, but if you really want to protect sites anywhere in the world, the first thing to do is to have good domestic law that protects the site and implement those laws. So that's really the key element, and the work that I am doing with my foundation and our partners is to develop that. But having, I mean, if Somaliland was a recognized state, and the UN, then of course that's a route you can put sites up for UNESCO. But I don't really see the point myself. Of course, you can have sites and brings maybe tourism a certain recognition, but the most important thing is to recognize your own sites yourselves and protect them and look after them. We have seen what has happened to World Heritage Sites around the world. Many of them are neglected. It depends.
Sure. Hi. Can you hear me, Sada? The next question is a very simple one. How can one own heritage? Are you there? Yeah, you froze slightly.
Yeah. How can one own heritage? Yeah. I think you can own heritage in the sense that you can own anything. As I said, things were communally owned. Heritage in the past was a collection of objects that were communally owned or came out at masquerades or ceremonies or tokenisms, things that your grandparents gave you, if that was an individual gift. So the whole ownership element is something that is part of the whole capitalist world, and where every square kilometer counts, and where people are losing their sacred landscapes to all sorts of interventions and intrusions. So ownership of heritage has become allowed within a capitalist system, within a system that values that aggressive competitiveness between neighbors than the collective sharing of heritage, which is very weird, because of course when we visit sites we see other people visiting and we feel a sense of connection with them, a sense of belonging, even if you're at Angkor Wat and there is a Chinese group and you come from Congo or wherever, you feel a sense of you are both appreciating something of human value, and that speaks to the human ability and condition. So we have this sense of appreciating heritage, which unfortunately the way things are is very much either disappearing or infringed on, if you like.
It's interesting that heritage, in a sense, implies a relationship between a person or people and objects or practices. It's not inherent in the object or in the person. So in a sense, you can't own it, you can only perform it. And that's one of the troubles with museums. It's often where objects go to die and they get turned into a heritage of a wrong sort, heritage, as it were, as an object rather than as a relationship. So, yeah. The next question, very simple one, is how much satellite imagery have you been using to help your archaeology? Do you use satellite imagery, or is that not relevant to the sort of work you do?
No, actually, I have not. Of course, I use Google Earth and I look at things and I kind of use that. At the beginning, when we didn't have all these great softwares, I was collecting maps, and that was basically the way I did my first surveys. But then now we have drones, but I would be very interested to look at satellite, because of course there's a whole new I know what this is doing, the way that we can remotely look at sites that are under threat in various parts of the world. We can map activities, how they looked before, how they are now, have there been more digging, illicit antiquities, sort of excavations. So there is a lot that you can do with satellite imagery, but I have not been using that much. I've been quite traditional. I mean, of course, I use drones and LIDAR technology, but not so much. Yeah.
Now, here's a very general question. Can you say some more about your knowledge-centered approach to heritage and how it can help us understand contested notions of the past? Oops.
Contested notions in the past. Well, the knowledge-centered approach is really, I like what you said earlier about this performance, because the way I worked, in fact, the knowledge-centered approach was a way for me to explore beyond the dominant narrative, explore beyond the accessible. So looking at knowledge in the pockets, in the areas where it appears, regardless of religion, ethnicity, class, resources. So going too deep into where people could teach me things about their practices, their history, their material culture. But at the same time, when we're using the knowledge-centered approach, for me, it in the study of rituals, it helped me to, or the material culture, especially for this book, I was able to look at the triadic, if you like, relationship between the material culture on one hand, the sacred landscapes, and the practices, and then observe the way things, the performance element of things, because often in African archaeology, we have conventional ways of looking at material culture. We are cataloging them, we are writing reports, we are doing these great maps, we are doing spatial analysis, we are doing all that, but we are not actually thinking in movement, in action. And I think this is a gap there where we are lacking scripture, we are lacking words, we are lacking the language, we are lacking this kind of intangible element, which for me has been useful because, in the sense, well, I mean, my own skills in linguistics have been very critical for my way of seeing how heritage is, how rituals are performed and where this material culture appears and when it doesn't appear, and what part of landscapes are used for what, and is everything sacred, and what can something stop being sacred if some certain actions are taken there. So for understanding the knowledge-centered approach, it's about getting at that performance of heritage and this interdisciplinary where you're looking at not only where the object is, but the words associated with an object, the other material associated with the object, and which landscapes are associated with the object, and how are these landscapes configured, and can you find a similar landscape that has those components in another area, and then map those and bring those together and see what the bigger picture can teach us about these societies and what values and cultural activities that mean something to them. And I think by lacking the language, the words, the scripture, we are also impoverished in African archaeology, but also in African history, because often we are lacking. Okay, recently we study, in archaeology, we've been so busy, myself and my colleagues, to rewriting African history through material culture. But we also have to actually look at how much we can understand cultures and societies today in order to also excavate, if you like, the mythologies, the ideologies, and the belief systems. Because this is a whole, objects can only tell us so much, monuments can only tell us so much. So the knowledge-centered approach is looking at the ideas and where they are spread, how they are spread, and how they vary, and where they connect or cut off, if you like.
I think it's very important. No, I think it's a wonderful answer. It gives some sense of how you can get around the issue of ownership, because knowledge isn't something that you own, at least in that capitalist sense. And it also, because we're coming to the end and we can't get any more questions in, I would just say that it's one of the ways in which you get across the issue of heritage creating exclusive groups, in the sense that knowledge is something that can be shared between groups in a way that it's harder, as it were, sometimes to share land or property, but knowledge is something that can be shared and performances can be shared. And there are ways in which, without challenging groups' identity, through zones of exchange, zones of intellectual exchange as well as, or cultural exchange, we can find actually the ways in which those boundaries of identity become more porous and therefore stronger, not weaker, by being more porous. And I think that your knowledge-centered approach really helps us get past that particular issue of the bad side of ownership. So, Sada, thank you so much. Wonderfully generous, as always, to listening to all the questions, answering as beautifully as you did. And thank you so much for taking part in this event. And I hope everybody has enjoyed it as much as I have. It's been a huge pleasure and an honor to have you here. And I'm just only sorry it has to be on Zoom and we can't be all in the room together, and so that you can't hear the full appreciation of the audience for what was a wonderful session. But thank you very much, and thank everybody who was there.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Thank you.